Bé, bon dia, benvinguts. Us dono la benvinguda en aquest acte d'inauguració del curs 2020-21 a la Facultat d'Humanitats i desena Lliçó Miquel Batllori, a qui sempre retem un homenatge en aquestes lliçons. Estem en un acte realment especial per a nosaltres, tant per al convidat que tenim com per la situació. Estem en una situació pràcticament de plató. El públic que ens escolteu sou a casa vostra o en els vostres llocs de treball, però fora d'aquest auditori on normalment sou. I a més també tenim el nostre convidat ben lluny, en un viatge digital. El tenim a Londres en aquest moment. James Smithies, welcome. We are very glad to meet you today and to enjoy your enormous knowledge and your great experience in the field of digital humanities. And we are sure that we'll really enjoy your lesson of today. La conversa d'avui la tindrem el doctor Smithies amb tres professors de la casa, amb María Morrás i amb Madella, que es dediquen a l'àmbit de les humanitats digitals des de fa molts anys, són els nostres experts. I a més avui tenim una doble benvinguda per al professor Simone Ventura, benvinguda a l'acte d'avui i benvinguda a la casa, perquè ben aviat s'incorporarà a treballar amb nosaltres i podrà ser el nou puntal per a la construcció de l'àmbit de les humanitats digitals a la nostra facultat, a la Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Ara just fa un any érem aquí mateix amb el poeta Zagajewski i no ens podíem imaginar de cap manera, en aquell moment, de cap manera, que seríem en la situació en què ens trobem ara i en tot el que hem passat. És la inauguració d'un curs realment especial, ja va ser el final del curs passat, curs difícil. En primer lloc hem de donar un missatge de confort a tots aquells membres de la comunitat, de la nostra comunitat universitària, alumnat, professorat, PAS, que estan patint molts directament, no només les conseqüències de la pandèmia, sinó directament els contagis, o han tingut en la seva família algun cas dolorós de malaltia o fins i tot de desenllaç fatal. El nostre primer missatge és de confort. Enmig d'aquesta situació, que és difícil, que és dolorosa, també volem donar un missatge d'ànim, fins i tot d'optimisme, d'alegria. Ja fa molts mesos que ens enviem entre nosaltres missatges per adaptar-nos a la nostra situació, a la nova situació, i el que volem és recordar que som creatius, recordar que tenim projectes nous, recordar que tenim iniciatives i que no ens podem aturar, que no ens volem aturar, que estem oferint i volem oferir en el nostre alumnat la millor formació i que aquesta formació, fins i tot en les circumstàncies actuals, és de gran qualitat. En la línia de projectes nous, parlar d'humanitats digitals és un dels nostres punts estratègics. Ha de ser un dels nostres puntals, sense dubte, les humanitats digitals. En una situació en què precisament avui estem en un digital trip entre el professor Smithies i nosaltres, doncs mai tan adequat per parlar del món digital. Fa 3 o 4 inauguracions com aquesta, us deien els estudiants com estudiar humanitats no pot ser de cap manera el resultat d'una fugida que a vegades es dona en algunes persones, d'una fugida del món de les matemàtiques o del món de les ciències. Hi ha alguns estudiants que han triat branques d'humanitats o la nostra mateixa carrera perquè en el seu moment varen dir no m'agraden les matemàtiques o no m'agrada la ciència o jo no soc del món dels ordinadors. I us vaig dir en aquell moment que quan algú fa una operació intel·lectual d'aquest tipus, en realitat s'està practicant una automutilació intel·lectual. Els humanistes, la gent del món de les humanitats, també coneixem la ciència i la ciència també representa per a nosaltres un puntal de la nostra mirada sobre el món, que hem de ser capaços de donar-hi suport i hem de ser capaços d'analitzar críticament. I el camp de les humanitats digitals ens demostra encara més aquesta relació que tenim i que hem de tenir. L'humanista, la persona de lletres, ha de poder dialogar amb el programador, ha de poder dialogar amb l'expert en bases de dades i fins i tot s'ha de formar, poc o molt, això és en part el que discutirem avui, fins a on l'humanista s'ha de formar en el món digital, en el món de l'electrònica i de la informàtica, i el que és segur és que ha de trobar el punt de col·laboració. Per tant, aquest camp, que és el que discutirem avui i que ja procedirem immediatament a comentar, és una gran esperança que tenim. És una línia estratègica de la nostra facultat, amb el director del departament, el Josep María Delgado, i amb els responsables de la universitat, estem planejant la constitució d'un laboratori d'humanitats digitals per poder donar un suport, crear un àmbit institucional per aquest camp d'estudi que ens interessa i que algun dia podrà ser i haurà de ser l'ocupació laboral d'alguns dels estudiants que en aquest moment ens esteu sentint. Doncs bé, moltes gràcies, benvinguts tots, i passo ja la paraula a Simone Ventura, que coneix directament, tots els ponents d'avui coneixen el professor Smithies, però ell el coneix especialment perquè hi ha treballat durant molt de temps i ens en podrà fer una presentació excel·lent. Moltes gràcies, Simone.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today to launch this academic year in these very special circumstances. I am thankful to the Pompeu Fabra and to José María Castellà and José María Delgado for having me here to present James Smithies, who is the director of the King's Digital Lab and my former colleague at King's College London. James is an outstanding scholar. He has been working on digital humanities now for many years. He has published consistently and worldwidely for the most prestigious journals and publishers. His last book was published in 2017 for Palgrave and Macmillan, and the title of the book is The Digital Humanities and the Digital Modern. He is working now on his last book project, which is entitled, tellingly, Digital Modernity. James' vision of the digital humanities is not as a kind of ancillary discipline. In his book, actually, he pointed out how the digital humanities were strategic, not just as a tool to foster our research in digital humanities, but rather as one of the potential cores of our disciplines. So in a climate where many people have been talking about the so-called crisis of the digital humanities, of the humanities, the digital humanities are there not just to help, but to strengthen the cause of the case for the humanities. So James is a world-leading top scholar in the field, in the digital humanities, but he is very proud of his roots as a humanist, and namely as a historian. He likes to define himself as a scholar, as an academic who participated of that transition from the more traditional way of doing things to the digital. Actually, he has been doing more than that, I'd say. His life, the most important steps of his career, show that he has been able to understand the situation, and not just to adapt, but to mold the experiences, the work that he has been doing in order to create, and not just to use, to create on, about, around digital humanities, and not just to use the digital as an instrument. He has been collaborating now with the Alan Turing Institute in London, and he has been, and he's one of those who wrote this very white paper on the challenges and the opportunities that data science and that data science prospect to the humanities. James has started as an historian, but his professional career spans through a very wide range of domains. He's been working in the private sector, he's been working for the government, just to move back to university and academia at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, where not only set up the website, the seismic.org.nz Earthquake Digital Archive, but he was also a true protagonist in the setting up of the associated DH program. James, it is worth saying, was the first appointment in the digital humanities in the New Zealand. Now he is working at King's College London, where he was summoned to establish the King's Digital Lab. I'm not going to give details about the King's Digital Lab, of course. James will do it in a minute for us. I'd rather say a word about my experience working with him and his team in London. I started working in King's in 2015, and I've been there for more than almost 6 years, working on a project, the Values of French, whereby the core of this project was the digital edition of a very long and rather obscure universal chronicle in Old French. I'd say that James and the team he has been able to create have been crucial for our success. Without them, actually, I'd say we wouldn't have achieved half of what we did. It is then with great pleasure that I will leave the floor to James now, and to Marco and Maria, who will join him in a conversation on the strategic values of digital humanities. So now we will give the opportunity to James to talk to us about the lab, about its history and its position within King's College London. James, I will leave you the opportunity to talk to us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introductions, and thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to speak to you. It's a shame that I can't be with you physically, but this will do. I'm having a few issues with audio, so I've turned my video off, and it seems to have improved. So apologies if I seem to miss a few things. So I've been asked to provide a basic overview of King's Digital Lab, which I will do now by presenting my screen. One thing before I start that it's worth noting is that I have a second role as Deputy Director of e-research for the college, which is a new initiative that's college-wide and exists to enable all disciplines. So one of the interesting and I think really enabling features of King's Digital Lab is that it's part of a wider college-wide initiative that allows us to benefit from college-wide strategy, unified college-wide strategy, and also contribute back to that strategy. There's a lot of value in doing that. But the story of King's Digital Lab is a long one. I arrived in 2015, but there have been perhaps 40, 50 years worth of activity in digital humanities at King's College before we were established. And that runs the gamut of the history through what was then called humanities computing, digital humanities. It really started to cohere in the early 1990s under Harold Short and the Centre for Computing in the Humanities. And then they started, sorry, a motorbike in the background of my home. Then they started doing some teaching. And in 2011, they changed the name of the centre to the Department of Digital Humanities to start conceiving it as more of a traditional academic field or discipline. And they've gone from strength to strength. They have approximately 600 students across multiple masters and undergraduate degrees. They have, I believe, 30 to 40 PhD students and approximately 40 staff, including researchers and teaching fellows. So the story of King's Digital Lab that I'm presenting here is only one half of the story of digital humanities at King's. And we sometimes talk about digital humanities at King's, or the model, in terms of enabling digital humanities at scale. And this is the caveat that you need to bear in mind with King's DH. It's a very large scale operation and unusual internationally. And I often say it's not necessarily a model that I would recommend, having it set up something similar, but on a much smaller scale in New Zealand. King's Digital Humanities has particular characteristics that are very useful and could and should be reused, but it's not a model that will suit many universities. So in 2015, the department had evolved to the point where they were trying to deliver teaching as well as software engineering, the kind of projects that we've done with Simone. And it became too complex in administrative, financial, and technical terms. So a decision was made to take the software engineering capabilities out of the department, put them in a standalone lab, and manage it separately to the academic department. And I was hired to establish that, and there were 6 staff members who joined the lab from the department. And so I'm speaking now after 5 years of operation, really. And we are fully operational, but it's taken 5 years because of the various complexities, and we've still got a long way to go. There's a lot more on the horizon that we could achieve. There's a lot that we still can't do, and a lot that we'd like to do. So we have 14 staff members, and that's scaled up to 19 at times through contract staff and postdocs. We have a project manager, 2 project managers actually, roles that we append research software to. So we have research software analysts, research software engineers, research software designers, a systems manager, and we also have research affiliates and visiting fellows. We inherited and then upgraded quite a significant infrastructure, around 200 virtual machines on our own, hosted on our own rack servers, close to 800 gigabytes of RAM, and we do explore the use of cloud services too, but we're basically on premise at the moment in a data center. The sites we maintain about 60 projects. We inherited 100. We get about 50 million web hits per year, and we host about 1.5 million digital objects. And to date, after 5 years, we've had about just over £10 million worth of successful grant funding we tend to consider about 200 ideas per year will be brought to us, and they result in around 30 grant bids. And the basic business model, which I can go into later, but it's quite enlightened, and it's a result of King's been engaged in digital humanities for so many years and understanding the problems. So we're supported, we're underwritten internally. So all of the staff are on permanent contracts, and the assumption is that we will exist in perpetuity, but we are supported by external funding. So we have a key performance indicator, or KPI, that aims to recover at least 70% of costs. So we sit within the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, which is slightly unusual in some ways as well. A lot of other digital humanities centres will share resource out of a central university centre, but we're hosted within the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, which is fantastic. You see on this org chart that we underpin digital capability across the whole faculty. We have a special relationship with the Department of Digital Humanities, of course, because we are evolved out of them, but we exist to increase digital capability, digital research capability across all departments. And we do work with all departments and centres. We work with external partners too, and occasionally work with people outside our faculty, but demand means that that's difficult. And what we do, the main thing that we do is to work with academic colleagues to develop collaborative research proposals and projects. So in the normal course of events, we will meet with a colleague who wants to put in a grant proposal with a digital component, and one of our analysts will meet with them, recommend tools, research methods, and work with them in a collaborative, intellectually scholarly collaborative way to define a technical solution in the pre-grant process. And that's costed, the technical requirements are defined, it's costed, and our colleagues put that into their grant bid, and when they get their funding, they come back to us and we build and maintain it. That's basically what we do. And we're talking digital resources, digital scholarly editions, archives, but also data analysis, visualizations, mobile apps, and we're starting to move into virtual reality and augmented reality as well. And that pre-grant process is really a consultancy, an internal consultancy service that we provide to our colleagues around digital methods and technologies. And we also have a big focus on sustainability. I mean, one of the big risks of setting up these digital centres is that they get swamped by the projects that they need to maintain once the project funding's finished. And we inherited 100 of those, which was very challenging. So we've developed methods, quite detailed methods for maintaining, but also sunsetting and appropriately archiving projects. We do have quite a significant infrastructure that we aim to provide to the whole faculty rather than college. We haven't really achieved that as much as we would have liked, to be honest. We run events, workshops, occasional internships and training, and the team have half a day a week to work on their personal projects to ensure that we have that experimental side of the lab as well. Now, this slide shows our software development lifecycle, which is an industry standard engineering process using Agile that we've tailored to a research context. But this, I won't go into it in detail, but it'll show you that the way in which the lab is trying to connect engineering processes that are required in order to build working products with the kind of flexible, creative research ethos that we need within academia. And that's the central creative tension in the lab that I don't think we've quite got it right yet. We work at a scale that sometimes means that the engineering processes overwhelm the creative and scholarly side of what we want to do, but we use these methods like SDLC to try and create that balance and manage that balance. You'll notice under the release phase that we use service level agreements. So we are set up in some ways like a commercial software team embedded within faculty. We assume that those commercial methods are just necessary in order to efficiently use our resources and produce high quality research outputs. This is an example of some of our work. It's a little bit out of date now. The Values of French is there, which is a flagship project. Some of these projects, actually, I'm looking at them now. The GoffMap, for instance, has actually been migrated to Oxford. So we sort of view the lab not just as an institutional lab, it's worth noting, but also a part of a national community. If a project is struggling to be maintained and it would be better off at a different institution, we'll help migrate it. Those community values are important to us. Some of our collaborators and funders, usual suspects really in the UK, but we do work with a broad range of external funders and collaborators. And we work quite closely with cultural heritage institutions across the UK as well, which is an important part of what we do. And in terms of a focus or a purpose for the lab, I think that's quite important, and that we occupy a place on the periphery of faculty. Ideally we're quite porous and have connections to the cultural heritage industry, external universities, but also the technology sector as well, and we can act as a broker between our academic colleagues and those other sectors. But in simple terms, that's a high-level view of the lab. This last slide is really what we'd like to present to our colleagues. Ideally, all of the complexity of the lab, and there's a significant amount, should be abstracted away, and our colleagues should just need to know that they can send us an email and we'll work with them to help build digital products. So that's the end of my introduction. I hope that it was intelligible.
Well, thank you very much, James, for this fantastic introduction to the digital humanities realities in King's College, London. And it is pretty clear from the brief intro that you gave us that King's College represents probably one of the oldest setting for the digital humanities in Europe, and then it today represents the cusp of digital humanities research in Europe and beyond. And one question that I would like you to enter is that obviously the development of the digital humanities in King's College happened over a long time, 30 years of development, and at a certain point it was established a department and then a digital lab. But starting a little bit the other way around, and wanted to set up a digital lab, before any other overarching structure. What do you think, and thinking about it as a kind of a recipe, like in a kitchen, what are the ingredients we have to put together? What would be your suggestion? What would be your vision in terms of a digital lab that should be set up, and what should be the dynamics that should be there?
It's the perfect question. I'm reductive about this. I think we should start with our epistemological and methodological goals. Now, every digital lab is going to look different, and there are major benefits of not having technical debt and starting afresh. But introducing technical or digital humanities to any environment is only going to work if you've got alignment with the epistemological and methodological goals and values of the faculty to start with. So and that's just not analog, as it were, traditional values and goals. But you need to ask that question of what you want digital to add to your intellectual soup, your scholarly environment. And in a way, that's the hardest question, because it can, at King's, we inherited a tradition of text encoding, for instance, that Simone has been involved in and used. But other faculties would probably want to jump straight into extended reality, virtual reality, augmented reality. We found it hard to build that capacity. We spent the last 5 years trying to move from the technologies that we inherited to those new technologies. But I think if you're starting fresh, so epistemology and method is key. It fundamentally needs to be a scholarly undertaking. It can't be a technical undertaking. Technology needs to be in the service of scholarship. You also need to think about, having said that, the alignment to computer science and IT. Especially, we can talk about this in terms of budgets and funding, but there's a big difference between having to maintain your own technical infrastructure and having the IT department do it for you. In New Zealand, the model we took, because we didn't have the resources or the scale to merit developing our own infrastructure, we partnered with our computer science department, and they took care of the wires and boxes, and we just turned up and could do our digital research on top of that infrastructure. Mm-hmm. There are benefits to maintaining your own infrastructure in-house, but there are methodological benefits, but there's also cost. And that alignment to computer science is key as well, because in a way, you need to triangulate a relationship between the humanities, your IT department, and your computer science department. Is digital humanities conceived as something, I don't mean this in negative terms, but amateurish? Is it about hacking digital capability within the humanities? Or is it about creating professional computer science outcomes for your graduates? And often I think it should be a middle ground between those two things, but a relationship with computer science is important. Even if computer science is just potentially aligned as a pathway for technically interested digital humanities students to move off to. Then sustainability, infrastructure I've talked about, sustainability and maintenance become key as well. And that means permanent contracts for staff, the staff that you hire. So HR, when I talk about technical sustainability, I always talk about HR as well. I mean, your human resources contracts are going to be key to the future of the lab. If you want an ephemeral lab, or perhaps you want to bootstrap something that you can experiment with for 5 years and see where it's going to go, then short-term contracts are fine. But if you're conceiving of digital humanities and a digital lab as a permanent element within your intellectual life, then you need to provide the technical people with permanent contracts. So infrastructure, sustainability, research funding is another key thing, obviously, to explore, and the balance between research funding and core funding. So we have in our lab, we have a 70% cost recovery KPI that we're meant to meet through external funding. But when you're setting up a new lab, you need to think about how you're going to incentivize that lab in terms of funding. So if you incentivize your lab to chase external funding, to bring in external funding and cover its own costs, you're not going to see that much of them. There'll be great projects and there'll be lots of activity, but your faculty colleagues and the students won't see so much of them. But if the faculty decide, well, we'll go 50-50, we'll underpin these contracts, and we will hire people that can work with staff and students on a free basis, then you'll have much better connection into the collegial life of your faculty. So there's a teaching versus research balance implicit in that as well. is, do you want it to be a research-led lab, or do you want it to be more engaged with teaching as well? You're going to have to get the intellectual balance right, but also the funding balance to support that. And finally, I guess my last thought in terms of those very initial questions is, to what degree it's a research laboratory or a teaching laboratory, and to what degree it's a service unit. To my mind, if it's a service unit, it shouldn't be in faculty. It should be in the IT department. But there's a continuum there, and I think service, we can talk about this later, but service or research, the provision of research services needs to be part of the mix. But I think the more, if I can use the word aggressive, intellectually aggressive approach to implementing a lab is to focus on pedagogy and research methods and foregrounding that.
Thanks.
So let me take this last point, which is of a lot of interest for our dean and the head of the department, which is the pathways of collaboration, because yes, the King's College Lab has 5 years, or has become operational in the last 5 years, but it's 30 years old, so there is a prehistory to it. And we're not even in the prehistory, we are just inside the shell still. So do you have any suggestion on how to start, in the sense of the American model is to encroach the lab inside the library? Most of the digital humanities labs I know from the United States are associated or even supported by the library, which usually has already some kind of infrastructure. Or you would say it's better to come bottom up and provide support for research projects, and starting with some isolated courses and then try to conglomerate them?
That's a good question. I think it obviously needs to be tailored to specific local contexts. So if you have a library that is open to digital humanities, and it can be aligned to their strategy, and it isn't just going to lapse into being a service unit, then I think libraries are fantastic places for DH centres, especially in terms of providing that long-term operational and financial security. I think that's a great model, and that can be done in partnership with, it can free up academic colleagues to do as you said and start folding it into their courses. But again, it's balancing the operational requirements or realities of your institution, and finding the path of least resistance there that I will enable sustainability, but also understanding what you want to do intellectually and pedagogically. It's interesting you mentioned, you're right about King's. When I turned up at King's, I was amazed at the level of maturity across all of the departments. The level of literacy around digital humanities was so high that I used to say I was surprised that I don't think I've ever had the conversation at King's, which is, what is digital humanities? Yeah. And in New Zealand, I used to have that hundreds of times. Okay. So I think it sounds like your situation is more like what I experienced in New Zealand, and you need to take a much longer strategic approach. So sort of maybe a 5 to 10 year plan. And I would encourage you to take a holistic approach. So think about the operational side of things, but focus on grassroots, as you suggested, hacking. Even for the first 2 years, not necessarily even having a standalone digital humanities course. Ideally, if you can hire a digital humanist to lead and eventually build a course like that, that would be great. But from the start, you just want to This is how I did it in New Zealand. We just looked at the existing courses and worked out how we could augment them with digital methods. And in the background for those first 2 years, well, we had a project that we used to bootstrap DH, but there are also conversations at a management level about the level of institutional commitment and where the money might come from. And I guess finally that brings me to another thought, how we did it in New Zealand. Because we didn't have anything, the level of understanding or awareness of digital humanities was very low, and the institutional knowledge and the institutional conversation about digital humanities wasn't very far along either. So we didn't really know how it was going to work from a financial and funding point of view. So we set up a flagship project based to create a digital archive to collect content from that was produced as a result of the earthquakes, and that sort of became our flagship project. But it also became a way to educate people about what digital humanities is and could be, and that project evolved after 5 years into a lab. So we sort of built the ethos of digital humanities out of that project, but also the started training graduate students who could then start working in a lab. And when we set up the lab and we transitioned to a lab, that project just became one of many within that lab.
Thank you. I don't know if Marco wants to.
Well, no, more than anything else, I was thinking, from what you say before, James, and also from what Maria asked, but I don't know, the perspective I can see for a lab in like a digital humanities lab, I would say that there are probably colleagues that could be user and colleagues that could be producer, in which you have people that have great idea that they need to be, and to develop such idea, they need the support from the digital humanities, they need methodologies, they need development through that channel. And then I can see colleagues that they are producing those supportive part, and obviously a lab should have both sides in a sense, because that's in a sense the discourse that is able to create the digital humanities, the discourse that is able to create the project and the teaching, that I would think that should be there. From your experience with many years working in such an environment, what would you see the situation in the sense that should we think of a balance of such part in the sense, I don't know, I'm making up, but 50-50, or you should have a more, push in terms of producer that then eventually will attract the users, or the other, you know what I mean? Is it this kind of, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, because in our lab, we're two-weighted towards the producer. So we have 14 research software engineers who can do the technical heavy lifting and help lead on the technical intellectual side of projects. What we lack is people who are freer to bring creative ideas to the lab and freer to fail, enabled to fail and be creative. So I think getting that balance right is absolutely key. And you've reminded me that I love these conversations, because it looks, we've been doing digital humanities at King's for 30 years or so, but no one's worked it out yet, and it's different in every environment. And I think there's a lot to consider in terms of intellectual labour, but also technical labour. And I'm waiting to see a new lab spring up where digital is fully integrated, elegantly integrated into the intellectual, operational, technical life of the university, and has the right balance in all its aspects. And to be fair, I don't think there's a centre or lab in the world that's achieved that yet, because there are political aspects and labour aspects as well as intellectual and technical, that need to go into the design of that product or that lab. So when that lab appears, it will be sort of an output or a result of quite a special intellectual community. And I wouldn't, for that reason, I wouldn't jump to implement a lab. I'd luxuriate in the first 2 to 5 years of working out what the might be and thinking about long-term questions about what kind of a lab would be world-leading, as well as serving our immediate and national community, and still exist in 100 years. Those are the sort of questions that humanists should be engaged in that are tricky to get right.
Thanks. Oh, go ahead. From a perspective of teaching, what would you say that will be, because what the dean at the beginning say, probably, I'm not sure if you pick it up, he was speaking in Catalan, and he was saying that that this is an extremely important line of development for the teaching within the university. And from your perspective, what would be the major advantages that a digital humanities lab would be able to offer to undergrad, beyond the fact that there will be project, there would be probably PhD thesis connected to that, but for the undergraduate perspective, what this will open in terms of opportunities for students, and what would be the extra opportunity that can give digital humanity to students from your many years of experience being into the field?
I mean, aside from digital literacy, which is an obvious and important outcome, so being able to read and interpret, read and interpret the digital world in a robust way. So being able to understand the difference between real news and fake news, etc. I think understanding, playing with the nuts and bolts of technical products helps you understand the way the digital world functions and increases your digital literacy in profound ways. But in that sense, and I've been saying this for 20 years now, that's really just upgrading the undergraduate curriculum to the point that it should be at. I think by embracing digital technology, humanists upgrade the humanities curriculum. But in more practical terms, in terms of graduate outcomes, it reminds me of when I was working in IT at the Ministry of Health in New Zealand. I was working in the IT department. And when I left to go back to academia, my manager said, send me more people like you. So, the reason that I was valuable in that setting was because there was a software engineering team of 50 people. There were clinicians that we were working with. There were policymakers, there were ministers of parliament. It's a very complex sort of context. They're trying to build health products to benefit New Zealanders. And what they were lacking were people who could translate. Business analysts, researchers, project managers who understood enough of the way that the digital world works and technical solutions function to translate between ministers and clinicians and the engineers who needed to build those products. And that's, I think, primarily, if we're thinking about this as a sort of a public good, if we're thinking of digital humanities as a pedagogical and public good, that's where we should be focusing on. We should be producing graduates who understand the critical and technical aspects of the digital world. And I've just given one example where they could go and work in government and help translate policy into technical solutions, or work with lawyers to develop policy to manage our interactions with the digital world, or police algorithms, etc. I mean, there are just any number of potential jobs that they could move into. So I'm not suggesting that we produce engineers, and that's where the messaging or expectation setting with digital humanities is quite tricky. and why the relationship with computer science becomes important as well. And you'll find it really beneficial to talk to computer scientists, because they'll say, well, hacking or teaching a few digital skills is almost, a lot of them will say it's worse than not doing anything at all, because you're just providing these amateur skills that aren't going to be useful to employers. But employers are saying something different. They want people who understand enough about technology to be responsible with it, and understand that engineers work under constraints. They can't turn lead into gold. But that's again, I think that's something that should come out of your conversations with computer science. I don't know if you've talked to the computer science departments, but trying to explain what you want to do to computer scientists used to be quite tricky. It might not be, it'll be dependent on your institution. But it'll really sort of help you frame the technical outcomes from digital humanities in an appropriate way.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank
Maria.
you so much. So you would suggest some kind of collaboration with, let's say, the technological department, but not to expect too much from them, no? Not too enthusiastic. I must say here in the Pompeu Fabra, there are several groups in the technological department which do what I think we could properly call digital humanities. Indeed. For instance, there is a huge group on music. They have a ERC and a COST 2020 project on making an archive of all the music in the world. So I think in that respect we're a little bit more in a better situation, but it's good to have this realistic view, I think. And picking up again on Marco's word, and we don't want to keep you much farther, but don't you think that the PhD students, the masters, and even undergraduates can provide this creative humus to the lab, in the sense that because they are starting, they are more daring, and they are asking that it's not expected. So they mean a challenge for the soft engineers and perhaps also for the older humanists as we are. Do you have any experience in that sense, that, opening the lab to younger people that perhaps apparently are not so expert or whatever, but they are digital natives, so they think on technology in a way that perhaps we cannot even conceive?
I think it's really important, and again, one of the issues in our lab is that we have had some interns, and they've been really valuable, but they tend to slow down or complicate the work of engineering. So we can't do it as much as we'd like, because engineers don't have enough time. But if we had more bandwidth, as it were, or more resources, we would absolutely bring in more students for creative purposes, but also to give them sort of a finishing school. I mean, I like the idea of digital labs being finishing schools, so that the postgrads, perhaps with some digital humanities experience, but not necessarily, could come and do an internship in the lab for a month and add it to their CV and get an understanding of how technical development environments work, and then move off into the real world. But there's a flip side to that reminds me when I was in New Zealand, I used to have postgrads knock on my door with fantastic ideas for projects, for digital projects. But because we didn't have an undergraduate digital humanities program in place, they didn't have the skills to start. And I ended up having to turn them away because they were really only, they needed 3 years undergraduate digital humanities in order to realize their ideas. And I used to feel a bit sorry for them, as though we'd let them down. I mean, ideally, we will scaffold digital skills all the way through the undergraduate curriculum. And that then becomes quite exciting, because by the time they get to postgrad or coming up with ideas for PhDs, they understand the constraints, they understand the tools and methods that are available, and can develop a sophisticated and realizable project in the same way that they would with history or English or classics. And this is our failure, isn't it, of our generation in a way, in that we have postgrads in classics and English and history who come up with fantastic PhD ideas, and they can go off, they've got the skills to realize them. And that would be my challenge to our community, is to build digital humanities programs and lace them through the undergraduate curriculum, so that those students can actually be of creative value to digital labs.
Well, thank you so much for the idea. Do you want to wrap up?
Do we still have time for
a last question?
Yes, yes. Sure.
One thing that I was wondering, obviously, from all this discussion, what is pretty clear that a digital humanities lab is a kind of land of encounters between people that are coming from different perspective, from different training, and so on, that they want to find something in common, and eventually from this common area, something new comes up. And with this perspective of situation of encountering and different setting, also something that could be interesting, and I wonder what is your idea on this, is about how much a digital humanities lab is something that is, teaching and research, and something that is also providing a service that could be an internal service, obviously within the university structure, but also an external service, as you quite well shown in your presentation of the Digital Humanities Lab in King's. And how much, if you think that there should be a balance in this, if the two sides are necessary, they should be there to be a successful setting, or eventually something that even comes naturally in your experience of dealing with the digital humanities?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one we struggle with every day. I actually view that as one of the central creative tensions in the lab. I think you need to see it as a tension, because the humanists are correctly, I think, suspicious of just that word service. It's loaded with a whole lot of neoliberalisms, basically, isn't it? I mean, there are some really sort of instrumentalist aspects to that word. I think we should embrace it and rehabilitate it. I don't think that service should be a dirty word. I think that's something that intellectuals and scholars should take pride in. But the problem is that as soon as we start using that word in the current academy, it tends to demote the providers of those services. And when that happens, when you get that slide towards a service culture in the same way that the IT department might provide services, then all of the intellectual energy and creative energy drains away as well. So I would say that, perhaps rather than having a balance, sort of a 20% foundations. It needs to be founded in services, because why else are we doing it? We have to have those foundations. But I'd like to think that only exists to enable the 80% of intellectual and creative energy. And again, I think everyone in our lab would admit that we haven't quite got that balance right. And it's to some degree by the financial model, by the local institutional characteristics, and also perhaps the trajectory that your lab is on in terms of its history. I think I'd like to think that more mature labs have more bandwidth to have and more sort of confidence to provide those services and potentially even provide external services, but not give up their intellectual and pedagogical mission, getting that balance right is those three things, isn't it? It's service, pedagogy, and research. Getting the balance right between those three is really key.
Thanks. Simone, do you want to?
Well, we get to the close.
Somebody that's been working with.
No, I mean, not so much a question. Maybe we are done with questions. It's about 40 minutes now that we are bombarding James with questions. But it was kind of, I was keen of getting my testimony sort of having as a constant point of reference the lab for us, how important that was at different moments. There was, of course, the aspect of the technical solution aspect, the urgent call to cope with specific problems. But then it became quickly clear to me that the project was started with some goals, and then the very fact of working with you and your team made the project slightly change, sort of, in its nature, in its methodology. I mean, you talked at the very beginning, you talked about the importance for a would-be project, for a would-be lab, to set up methodological and epistemological goals and values. Well, I am a witness here as to the fact that working with you made our goals that were supposed to be clear at the beginning, having a different status, a different nature. So just to say how intellectually important is working with a unit. I don't know whether we want to call it a lab or a digital humanities unit, an office attached to the library, but the fact that there is such a physical point of reference made all the difference for us. It's not just capabilities, it's not just resources, it's a horizon, a place where we could develop our thought together with you and not through you. This is what I wanted to.
That's a nice end. Do you want to close the?
Finish? Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Smithies, for your great conversation and lecture at the same time. We invite you to visit us in a royal trip in Barcelona as soon as the pandemics
that would be great.
would be a bit kind with us. And we are very grateful to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James, for a nice conversation.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much, James.
I aleshores
Thank you. I love these conversations. They're always motivational.
Thank you very much. Per cloure ja l'acte, som en un acte d'inauguració del curs. Per tant, després d'aquesta conversa i lliçó magnífica que ens ha ofert el professor Smithies i que hi han col·laborat brillantment els professors del nostre departament que tracten la mateixa qüestió, ens ha il·lustrat molt bé sobre com hem d'actuar a partir d'ara per iniciar decisivament una línia d'humanitats digitals a la nostra universitat, en col·laboració amb els altres departaments que també hi poden estar implicats, com això ha de tenir, evidentment, un gruix en la nostra recerca, però també ha de tenir implicacions en la docència de postgrau i de grau en una línia que un itinerari del grau pogués centrar-se en aquests aspectes que són una aposta nostra de futur imprescindible. Anirem cap aquí, ho prometem als estudiants i ens ho prometem a nosaltres mateixos. I arriba el moment ja de cloure l'acte, i en un acte així el degà ha d'actuar segons el principi austinià d'acte de parla, en què declara formalment inaugurat el curs 2020-2021 a la Facultat d'Humanitats de la Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Moltes gràcies a tothom.